The telegram arrived at the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe at 6 o'clock on a November morning in 1878, carried by a rider whose horse had nearly died beneath him crossing the 30 miles from Cimarron. The paper trembled in Thomas Wilson's weathered hands, not from age or weakness, but from something far more dangerous, the cold, focused rage of a man who had spent 3 decades learning to control precisely such emotions. The words were brief. Violence always was. Thomas, stop. James, taken. Stop. Blackwood gang, stop. Come alone or boy dies. Stop. Margaret. Thomas Wilson was 55 years old that November morning. His hair had gone steel gray years before his face carved into hard lines by wind and sun, and the weight of 100 manhunts across 3 territories. He had worn the federal marshal's badge for 30 years since the end of the war that had divided the nation and defined his generation. In those 3 decades, he had tracked 147 wanted men across mountains and deserts and frozen plains. He had brought back 124 of them alive to face trial and justice. The other 23 had chosen to make their stand with guns drawn, and Thomas Wilson had obliged them with the precision that had made his name legendary among lawmen and outlaws alike. He did not miss, he did not hesitate, and he did not forget. But no amount of training, no years of experience tracking the worst men the frontier could produce, had prepared him for the moment when the hunt turned personal, when the prey became the predator, when the badge on his chest meant nothing compared to the 9-year-old boy whose life hung in the balance, his nephew, his sister Margaret's only child, the boy he had promised to protect. Thomas set the telegram on his desk with careful precision, smoothing the wrinkled paper with fingers that had steadied themselves through sheer force of will. Around him, the marshal's office slowly came to life with the morning, deputies arriving for the day shift, the clerk stoking the iron stove against the mountain cold, the familiar rhythms of law and order that had defined his adult life. All of it suddenly meaningless. He stood the motion automatic after decades of military and law enforcement discipline. His hand went to the gun belt hanging on the coat rack, fingers finding the worn leather with the muscle memory of 1,000 mornings. The Colt Peacemaker settled into its holster with a weight that felt different this morning. Not the tool of justice, the instrument of something older and darker. A memory surfaced unbidden but sharp as broken glass. 3 years ago, his wife Anna lying in their bed, the mountain fever burning through her, while he rode 100 miles north chasing a counterfeiter who had killed a shopkeeper in Raton Pass. By the time he returned, summoned by telegram, she had been dead 2 days. The last words she had spoken, the deputy told him, were a question, "Where is Thomas?" He had not been there. Duty had called, and Thomas Wilson always answered duty's call. It was who he was, who he had always been. Anna had understood. She had married a federal marshal after all, had accepted the absences, the dangers, the lonely nights. But understanding and acceptance did not change the fact that she had died alone, calling for a husband who chose badge over bedside. On that terrible day, standing over her grave with Margaret beside him and young James clutching his aunt's hand, Thomas had made a silent vow. He would not fail his family again, would not let duty eclipse the bonds of blood. Now, 3 years later, that vow faced its test. The office door opened. Thomas looked up to see Vernon Hastings filling the doorframe, his white beard catching the early morning light. At 68, Vernon was technically retired, having turned in his badge 5 years prior after 4 decades of service. But retirement for men like Vernon Hastings was more a change of title than occupation. He still kept an office in the federal building, still advised on difficult cases, still represented everything Thomas aspired to be: competent, incorruptible, and wise enough to know the difference between justice and revenge. Vernon had trained Thomas when he first pinned on the badge in 1848, fresh from his cavalry service in the war. Had taught him to read trails and men with equal skill, had shown him that true law enforcement was not about the gun, though the gun had its place, but about patience and precision and the absolute certainty that wrong could be made right. "Tommy," Vernon said, his voice carrying the gravelly warmth of old friendship. "Telegraph operator said you had urgent business." "What is it?" Thomas handed him the telegram without speaking. Words seemed inadequate to the moment. Vernon read it once, then again, more slowly. His weathered face, which had stared down Apache war parties and Mexican bandits and every variety of outlaw the frontier produced, went pale. "Ezra Blackwood," Vernon said finally, the name carrying weight and history. "Confederate major we arrested in '65, the one who escaped from territorial prison 6 months back." Thomas nodded. "He has James." Vernon lowered himself into the chair across from Thomas's desk, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose joints had endured too many winters. "Lord have mercy. The boy is what now? 9 years old. 9 this past August." Thomas's voice was steady, but Vernon knew him well enough to hear what lay beneath the control. "Same age Eli was when I found him." They both understood the reference. Elijah Carter, now 28, and serving as a junior marshal under Thomas's command, had been orphaned at 9 when Comanchero raiders killed his parents. Thomas had tracked the raiders for 200 miles, brought them to justice, and taken responsibility for the traumatized boy who had nowhere else to go. Had raised him, trained him, given him purpose and direction. Had saved him in the way that mattered most. Now James needed saving, and the man who had taken him was no random outlaw. Ezra Blackwood was calculating, ruthless, and possessed of the kind of intelligence that made him far more dangerous than the common frontier criminal. The door burst open. Elijah Carter entered with the controlled urgency of a man who had learned discipline from the best teacher available. At 28, Eli stood lean and hard as ironwood, his dark eyes carrying the watchful intensity of someone who had seen too much too young and learned to survive it. "Sir," Eli said, slightly breathless. "Heard about the telegram from the night clerk. Already saddled horses and packed emergency supplies. When do we ride?" Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Not surprise exactly. Eli's loyalty was beyond question. But the immediate unthinking commitment to action spoke to bonds deeper than duty. "Eli," Thomas said carefully, "this is not official martial business. Blackwood demands I come alone. If you and Vernon ride with me, you are violating direct orders from a hostage-taker. There could be consequences." Vernon made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "Tommy, I have worn this badge for 40 years. Trained you when you were 25 and still wet behind the ears from cavalry service. You think I am going to let you ride into an ambush alone because some Confederate outlaw says so?" Eli stepped forward, his young face set with the kind of determination that could not be argued with. "Boss, you saved me when I was orphaned, raised me, trained me, gave me a life worth living. James is family, which makes this personal for me too. I am riding with you, and that is the end of the discussion." Thomas looked between them. Vernon, who had been like a father to him. Eli, who was like a son, both willing to risk everything for a cause that by all rights should have been his burden alone. "Blackwood will not expect a team," Thomas said slowly, the tactical part of his mind already working. "He expects me desperate and reckless, coming in alone." Vernon nodded. "Then we give him exactly that appearance, but with 80 years of combined martial experience backing your play." Thomas unfolded the territorial map on his desk, weighing it down with a coffee cup and an inkwell. His fingers traced the mountain ranges between Santa Fe and the Sangre de Cristo peaks, where intelligence suggested Blackwood had established his base. "Last report from our undercover contact," Thomas said, "places Blackwood's operation at the old Broken Promise mine, abandoned silver claim in the high country. Defensible position with sight lines on all the standard approaches. 12 to 15 men in his gang, all experienced." Eli studied the map with the practiced eye of a trained tracker. "Frontal assault would be suicide. We need inside information, someone who knows that terrain." Vernon looked up from the map, his sharp old eyes thoughtful. "You need a scout, someone with connections to the Apache bands that hunt those mountains." Thomas had already reached the same conclusion. "I know someone, Daniel Stormwalker's widow, Ayanna. Her homestead is in Eagle's Nest Canyon, maybe 10 miles from the Broken Promise. She has ties to the Apache scouts, knows every trail and water source in that range." "The Apache widow," Vernon's tone was careful. "Will she trust us enough to help?" "Daniel was my friend," Thomas said. "Before he died 3 years back, he helped me investigate banking fraud tied to territorial land schemes. He knew things, dangerous things. And his widow has reason to hate the Blackwood operation." Eli raised an eyebrow. "What reason?" "3 days ago, according to my contacts, Blackwood's men stole her prize mare, a chestnut called Ember, premium bloodline worth a small fortune. They are building a horse smuggling network to support their land grab schemes. Need quality stock." Vernon made a thoughtful sound. "So she has motivation. Question is whether she will trust federal authority enough to work with us." Thomas was already moving, buckling on his gun belt with practiced efficiency. "Only one way to find out. Vernon, I need you to handle logistics. Wire Deputy Marshal Franklin at Raton Pass. Have him stage 10 men at Widow's Pass as reserve backup. Quiet positioning, no visible presence." Vernon nodded, already making notes. "Consider it done. Eli, you ride with me to the Stormwalker homestead. We will brief Ayanna, coordinate with her Apache contacts, and plan infiltration routes." "Yes, sir." Thomas picked up the telegram one more time, reading his sister's desperate words. Margaret was alone in Cimarron, her husband dead 2 years from a logging accident, raising James by herself through sheer determination and the small income from her dressmaking business. She had no one else to turn to, no one else who could face men like Ezra Blackwood. "We ride in 30 minutes, Thomas said. "Travel light and fast. Blackwood moved his timeline up for some reason. I do not think we have much time." The sun was climbing toward noon by the time Thomas and Eli rode into Eagle's Nest Canyon. The November air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and the aspens on the high slopes had already surrendered their leaves. The canyon itself was a sheltered pocket of relatively flat land, protected by red rock walls and watered by a reliable spring. Good ranch country, the kind of place a man could build something lasting. Daniel Stormwalker had built that something. The homestead showed the care of someone who understood the land and respected it. Split rail fences in good repair, a solid cabin with proper chinking against the cold, corrals sized for a small breeding operation, everything neat and functional and built to last. Except Daniel had not lasted. Mountain fever had taken him 3 winters ago, leaving his Apache wife to maintain the operation alone. As they approached, a figure emerged from the cabin. Ayanna Stormwalker was 43 years old. Thomas knew, though she moved with the fluid grace of someone half that age. Her Apache heritage showed in her high cheekbones and dark eyes, in the way she stood utterly still while tracking their approach. She held a rifle with the casual competence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. Thomas raised his hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent, then dismounted slowly. "Mrs. Stormwalker, Marshal Thomas Wilson, we met at Daniel's funeral." The rifle lowered slightly. "I remember, Marshal. This is not a social visit." "No, ma'am, it is not. I need your help. The Blackwood gang took my nephew 3 days ago. Boy is 9 years old." Something shifted in Ayanna's expression. Not quite sympathy, but recognition. "I heard about the kidnapping. Nietzsche's scouts reported unusual activity at the Broken Promise. Armed men, more than the usual patrols." She paused. "They also took something of mine 3 days ago, my mare Ember." Eli spoke up, his voice respectful. "Ma'am, we are not asking you to risk your life. Just need terrain knowledge, maybe connections to Apache scouts who know the area." Ayanna's eyes moved from Thomas to Eli and back again, assessing. Daniel told me you were one of the good ones, Marshal. Said you could be trusted when most white lawmen could not. He gave you information about the Harrington bank fraud before he died. Information that could have gotten him killed if the wrong people knew. Thomas nodded slowly. Your husband was a brave man and a good friend. What he told me about Samuel Harrington's land schemes helped us build a case. We are still gathering evidence. Then you know Blackwood is just the muscle, Ayanna said. Harrington is the brain, the banker pulling strings from Denver. I know. Ayanna lowered the rifle completely. Daniel wanted to see Harrington brought to justice. Knew the banking fraud was destroying honest homesteaders and Apache families alike. If helping you gets us closer to that goal, then I will help. She paused. But I am not writing as support. I am a full partner in this. My tracking skills, my Apache connections, my knowledge of the terrain, equal voice in planning. Thomas met her eyes, saw steel there and capability and the kind of quiet competence that could not be faked. Daniel Stormwalker had chosen well. Deal, Thomas said, extending his hand. You lead terrain navigation and coordinate with Apache scouts. I lead tactical planning. We work together. Ayanna shook his hand with a grip that matched his own for strength. Then let us make a plan that gets your nephew and my horse back alive. By the time the sun touched the western peaks, the four of them were gathered around a small fire outside Ayanna's cabin. Vernon had ridden in an hour earlier, bringing supplies, and the confirmation that Deputy Marshal Franklin had men positioned at Widow's Pass. Thomas spread the map across a flat rock, weighing the corners with stones. Intelligence from our undercover contact says Blackwood is holding a meeting tomorrow. Territorial officials, the banker Harrington, maybe military representatives, some kind of land deal signing. Vernon studied the map with the careful attention of 4 decades' experience. He is using James as insurance. If we raid before the meeting, the boy dies. If we wait until after Blackwood has what he wants, and the leverage disappears. Ayanna traced her finger along a route through the mountains. Blackwood will expect you to come alone, Marshal. Desperate uncle trying to save his nephew. He will not expect a coordinated team using Apache trails. How many sentries does he have posted? Eli asked. Naichi counted 3 lookout positions when his scouts last observed the camp, plus roving patrols during daylight. At night they pull in closer to the main buildings, confident in their defensive position. Thomas made mental calculations. 3 lookouts meant Blackwood was taking the threat seriously, but not expecting a major assault. Overconfident, perhaps. Or simply realistic about how few people would be foolish enough to attack a fortified position in mountain terrain. Vernon, Thomas said, you handle logistics and backup coordination. Make sure Franklin's men know the extraction routes and fallback positions. Vernon nodded already, making notes in his worn leather journal. Eli, you work with Ayanna on infiltration routes. Study the Apache trails she knows. I want 3 different approach vectors mapped and memorized. Copy that, boss. Thomas looked at the map at the terrain between here and the Broken Promise Mine, at all the ways this could go wrong. I will pose as the lone marshal coming to negotiate. Give Blackwood what he expects. While I have his attention, you move into position for extraction. Ayanna frowned. That is dangerous, Marshal. If Blackwood suspects deception, he wants me, Thomas said flatly, has wanted me since I arrested him in '65. This is personal for him, not just business. Personal enemies make mistakes. Lower their guard to gloat. Vernon looked up from his journal, his weathered face troubled. Tommy, last time you went undercover solo in hostile territory, you nearly did not come back. Nearly does not count Vernon, and James does not have time for safe plays. The old marshal held his gaze for a long moment, and Thomas saw the argument forming, saw Vernon recognizing the same reckless edge that had gotten younger marshals killed over the years, the desperate need to act rather than plan. But before Vernon could speak, a sound cut through the evening air, distant but unmistakable. A gunshot. Single report echoing across the canyon from the direction of the Broken Promise Mine. Ayanna was on her feet instantly, head cocked, listening. That came from Blackwood's position. Thomas felt ice settle in his stomach. James, another shot, then silence. Eli was already moving toward the horses. We need to move now. But Thomas held up a hand, forcing himself to think tactically despite every instinct screaming to ride hard toward that sound. Wait, we do not know what that was. Could be internal discipline, could be a trap to draw us in reckless. Vernon was on his feet too, reading the conflict on Thomas's face. Tommy, son, I know what you are feeling, but charging in blind gets the boy killed, and you with him. Thomas closed his eyes, breathed, found the center of calm that 3 decades of dangerous work had taught him to access even in crisis. When he opened his eyes again, the marshal was back in control. Ayanna, he said quietly. How long to reach the broken promise using the Apache shortcut through Thunder Canyon? 90 minutes on horseback. But in darkness through that terrain, she paused, then nodded. I can guide us. It will be dangerous, but possible. Vernon, send word to Franklin. Have his men at Widow's Pass by 11 tonight. Full tactical readiness. Consider it done. Thomas looked at each of them in turn. Vernon, who had taught him everything that mattered about being a lawman. Eli, who represented the next generation of that tradition. Ayanna, who carried her own grief and her own causes, but was willing to risk everything for a child she had never met. We ride in 10 minutes, Thomas said. Travel silent, no talking once we hit the canyon approaches. Ayanna leads. Eli and I follow. Vernon, you coordinate backup positioning and maintain communication with Franklin's team. Vernon gripped his shoulder. Bring that boy home, Tommy, and bring yourself home too. You made Anna a promise, and you made me a promise. Do not make me bury another friend. Thomas met the old man's eyes, saw fear there and love, and the weight of too many funerals. I will be careful, I promise. They gathered their gear in tense silence. Thomas checked his Colt Peacemaker, the gun that had served him faithfully for 5 years since the model's introduction, checked his Winchester rifle, his spare ammunition, the tools of his trade familiar as his own hands. But as he swung into the saddle and followed Ayanna toward the dark mouth of Thunder Canyon, Thomas knew that guns and tactics might not be enough. Ezra Blackwood was not a common outlaw. He was intelligent, experienced, and driven by the same demons that haunted every man who had survived the war between the states. The canyon swallowed them, rock walls rising on either side, the November stars cold and distant overhead. Ayanna rode point, somehow finding a path through terrain that looked impassable. Behind Thomas, Eli rode in silence, and Thomas felt grateful for both their presence and their competence. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, a 9-year-old boy waited, frightened, alone, wondering if his uncle would come. Thomas Wilson had spent 30 years hunting men who deserved hunting, had brought justice to territories that knew only violence, had worn the badge with honor and never once questioned the cost. But tonight, riding through darkness toward an enemy who knew him too well and wanted him too badly, Thomas understood something he had never quite grasped before. Justice was not abstract. It was personal. It was the face of a frightened boy, the memory of a dying wife, the weight of promises made and kept. And sometimes, just sometimes, the right thing and the smart thing were not the same. The canyon narrowed ahead, and Ayanna raised a hand in warning. They slowed to a walk, hoofbeats muffled on sandy ground. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, Ezra Blackwood waited with a hostage and a grudge and a plan that would test everything Thomas Wilson had ever learned about law and loyalty and the difference between justice and revenge. The hunt was on, and this time Thomas Wilson was both the hunter and the hunted. Thunder Canyon earned its name honestly. Even on still nights, wind howled through the narrows like distant artillery, and every hoofbeat echoed against stone walls that rose 200 feet on either side. The November moon gave just enough light to turn the path into a ribbon of silver, threading through absolute darkness, and Ayanna Stormwalker navigated it with the quiet confidence of someone who had ridden these trails since childhood. Thomas Wilson followed 10 yards behind, trusting her completely because he had no other choice. The canyon floor was treacherous with loose rock and sudden drop-offs, and one misstep would send horse and rider tumbling into crevices deep enough to swallow both without trace. Behind him, Eli Carter rode with the tense alertness of youth, one hand resting on his rifle eyes, constantly scanning the rim high above for any sign of sentries. They had been riding for 70 minutes when Ayanna raised a hand and reined to a stop. Thomas pulled up beside her, and she leaned close enough that her whisper barely carried over the wind. Half-mile ahead, the canyon opens to a plateau. Broken Promise Mine is on the far side. We leave the horses here and proceed on foot. Thomas nodded. They dismounted in silence, securing the horses in a protected alcove where rock overhang would hide them from casual observation. Eli distributed supplies from the saddlebags with practiced efficiency. Ammunition, rope, the tools of their trade. Ayanna moved among them like a shadow, checking their gear with the critical eye of someone whose life had depended on such details. She paused at Thomas's gun belt, her fingers touching the Colt Peacemaker. "If shooting starts," she said quietly, "Blackwood will kill the boy immediately. You understand this." "I understand." "Then you also understand that your nephew's life depends on you keeping that gun holstered no matter what Blackwood says or does." Thomas met her eyes in the moonlight. "I have been doing this work for 30 years, Mrs. Stormwalker. I know how hostage situations play out. Knowing and controlling are different things, Marshal, especially when family is involved." She was right, and Thomas knew it. The rage that had settled in his chest since reading Margaret's telegram was a living thing, patient and cold, and waiting for any excuse to explode into action. 3 decades of discipline were all that kept it leashed. "I will control it," he said. Ayanna studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Good, because if you do not, we all die, and the boy dies worst of all." They moved through the last quarter-mile on foot, using every scrap of cover the broken terrain provided. The plateau opened before them, gradually revealing the clustered buildings of the old mining operation. Someone had restored the structures enough for habitation. Light showed in windows, smoke rose from chimneys. Guards walked patrol routes with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves secure. Thomas counted 7 visible sentries, professional spacing, overlapping fields of observation. Whoever commanded Blackwood's security understood military tactics. Ayanna touched his shoulder and pointed to a position on the eastern ridge where firelight reflected off metal. A lookout with a rifle watching the main approach from Cimarron. She pointed again, indicating 2 more positions north and south. The perimeter was well covered, but no perimeter was perfect. There were always gaps, always blind spots created by terrain or human complacency. The question was whether those gaps were intentional traps or genuine weaknesses. Vernon Hastings materialized from the darkness like a ghost moving with surprising stealth for a man his age. He had circled wide to scout the western approach and now crouched beside Thomas, breathing only slightly harder than normal. "Franklin's men are in position at Widow's Pass," Vernon whispered. 20 federal marshals staged and ready. They wait for your signal." He paused. "Also found something interesting. Deputy Roy Hastings from Cimarron rode in an hour ago, went straight to the main building like he owned the place." Thomas felt ice settle in his gut. Roy Hastings was the senior deputy in Cimarron responsible for law enforcement in the territory where Margaret lived, where James had been taken. "You certain it was him? Recognize the horse, that distinctive paint mare he rides, and the way the guards greeted him. Familiar." "Expected," Eli swore under his breath. "Inside man. That is how Blackwood knew exactly when to take James, how he knew Margaret would telegraph you, how he has stayed ahead of every warrant and raid." Thomas processed this revelation with the cold, tactical part of his mind. A corrupt deputy changed everything. It meant Blackwood had been receiving intelligence about federal operations, about Thomas's movements and plans, about vulnerabilities in law enforcement coordination. It also meant someone would pay for that betrayal, but that accounting would come later. Right now, the priority was James. "Changes nothing about our approach," Thomas said. "Still need inside intelligence before we move. Mrs. Stormwalker, your contact. Can we trust her?" Ayanna nodded. "Sarah Morgan, widow whose husband was killed by Blackwood's men 6 months ago during a store robbery in Cimarron. They took her as camp cook. Keep her compliant with threats against her sister's family." She paused. "Sarah hates Blackwood with everything she has. She will help if she can." "How do we make contact?" "She gathers firewood at dawn, alone usually. There is a stand of dead pine east of the main buildings. I can intercept her there." Thomas checked his pocket watch. Nearly midnight. 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours that felt like 6 years. "We wait," he decided. "Use the time to map patrol patterns and identify where they are holding James. Vernon, you coordinate positioning with Eli. I want 3 fallback routes planned and memorized." Vernon nodded. "And you?" "I am going to introduce myself to Ezra Blackwood. Convince him I came alone and desperate exactly like he wanted." Ayanna grabbed his arm. "That is suicide." "That is the only play that keeps James alive long enough for you to get him out." Thomas pulled free gently but firmly. "Blackwood wants me. Has wanted me for 13 years. I give him what he wants. His attention focuses on me instead of perimeter security. Boss," Eli said, his young voice tight with concern, "if he realizes we are out here, then you move fast and extract the boy before Blackwood can react. But he will not realize. I have played this game before." Thomas met each of their eyes in turn. "Trust me. And be ready." He started to move, but Vernon's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "Tommy," the old marshal said quietly, "remember what I taught you. Pride and anger are luxuries lawmen cannot afford. You stay cold. You stay smart. You come back alive." Thomas gripped Vernon's hand. "I remember everything you taught me, old friend, including when rules need breaking." He walked into the firelight alone. The main building of the Broken Promise mine had once been the supervisor's office back when silver flowed from the mountain and men believed fortunes could be carved from stone. Now it served as command center for a different kind of operation. Through the windows, Thomas could see men gathered around tables, maps spread out. The trappings of planning and organization that elevated Blackwood's gang from common outlaws to something more dangerous. The guards spotted him when he was still 50 yards out. Rifles swung to cover him instantly, and voices called challenges into the night. Thomas raised his hands, making no move toward his gun. "Federal Marshal Thomas Wilson, I am here to see Ezra Blackwood. He sent for me." Movement in the shadows. 4 guards materializing from positions Thomas had not spotted surrounding him with professional efficiency. Hands roughly searched him, removing the Colt Peacemaker and the backup Derringer from his boot. One guard found the marshal's badge and held it up to the firelight. "It is him," the guard said. "The uncle." "Take his weapons to the major," another guard ordered, "and bring the marshal inside. Carefully. He is dangerous." They escorted him across the compound with rifles pressed to his spine. Thomas used the walk to memorize details, building layouts, guard positions. The corral where 24 horses stamped and shifted in the cold. No sign of a chestnut mare, which meant Ember was being kept separately. High-value stock protected. And somewhere in these buildings, James waited, frightened, alone, trusting that his uncle would come. The door opened and Thomas stepped into warmth and lamplight. The room beyond had been converted into something resembling a military command post. Detailed maps covered one wall. A large table dominated the center, scattered with documents and ledgers. And at the head of that table, standing with the rigid posture of a man who had worn Confederate gray, stood Ezra Blackwood. 13 years had changed him. The Major Thomas remembered from the war's chaotic final months had been lean and dangerous, all sharp edges and burning intensity. This Blackwood carried more weight and more scars. His hair had gone iron gray. Deep lines bracketed his mouth. But the eyes were the same, intelligent, calculating, absolutely certain of his own righteousness. Marshal Wilson, Blackwood said, his cultured Southern accent unchanged by time or circumstance. How good of you to accept my invitation. Thomas said nothing. Studied the room instead. 5 other men present. 3 clearly hired guns watching him with professional wariness. 1 well-dressed civilian type with soft hands and expensive clothes. A banker, perhaps, and standing near the door trying to look inconspicuous, Deputy Roy Hastings. Blackwood followed his gaze and smiled. Ah, yes, you have noticed our friend from Cimarron. Deputy Hastings has been quite helpful in coordinating our operations, gave us detailed intelligence about your movements, your routines, your vulnerabilities. Roy Hastings had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not ashamed. Never ashamed. Just a man who had made his choice and would live with it. Where is my nephew? Thomas asked, his voice flat and cold. Safe, unharmed, being held in comfortable quarters with adequate food and water. Blackwood gestured to a chair. Please sit. We have much to discuss. I will stand, Blackwood shrugged. As you wish. Though I confess I am disappointed, Marshal. I expected you to come alone, desperate and emotional. Instead you arrive calm and controlled, almost as if you have backup positioned nearby. Thomas felt his heart rate spike but kept his expression neutral. I followed your instructions, came alone. Did you? Blackwood moved around the table with the smooth grace of a trained officer. Because my sentries report no unusual activity, no federal forces marshaling, no obvious assault preparation, which means either you truly are alone and suicidal, or you have help positioned so carefully that even my experienced men cannot detect them. The well-dressed civilian spoke up, his voice carrying the smooth tones of money and education. Major Blackwood, might I suggest we proceed with business? The Territorial Commissioner arrives in 6 hours for the land transfer signing. We need those documents verified. Blackwood waved him silent. Patient Samuel, the Marshal and I have history to discuss first. He turned back to Thomas. Do you remember Fort Kearny, Marshal, November of '65? You commanded the cavalry detail that arrested me and my men. Thomas remembered it with perfect clarity. The flashback hit him with sensory intensity. November 1865. 3 years of war finally ended. Thomas Wilson, newly minted cavalry lieutenant, leading a patrol through Missouri hunting Confederate deserters. They had found Blackwood's unit camped in an abandoned farmhouse, flying no flag, following no chain of command. Just soldiers who refused to accept that their cause was lost. The standoff had been tense. Blackwood had been a major, outranking Thomas significantly. But rank meant nothing when the government you served no longer existed. Thomas had given him the choice: surrender to federal authority or face consequences. Blackwood had chosen surrender, had laid down arms with dignity and honor, had marched his men into custody believing that the war was over and mercy would be granted. Instead, they had been tried as traitors. 3 of Blackwood's officers were hanged. Blackwood himself received a 20-year sentence in territorial prison where he had languished until his escape 6 months prior. I remember, Thomas said. You surrendered honorably. I gave you my word you would be treated fairly. Your word, Blackwood repeated, his voice soft and dangerous. Your word which meant nothing when politics demanded scapegoats. Your word which could not save my men from the noose. I did everything in my power. Your power was insufficient. Blackwood's control cracked for just a moment, revealing the rage beneath. Then it smoothed again, professional soldier, reasserting dominance. But that is ancient history, Marshal. Water long since passed under the bridge. I did not bring you here for revenge. I brought you here for leverage. The civilian Samuel cleared his throat nervously. Major, perhaps we should focus on the transaction. Silence Harrington. Blackwood never took his eyes off Thomas. "The marshal needs to understand the situation completely before we proceed. Samuel Harrington." The name connected in Thomas's mind with the banking fraud Daniel Stormwalker had been investigating. The schemes to steal homestead land through manufactured debt, the corruption that reached into territorial government, and something else, something that made Thomas's blood run cold. "You," Thomas said, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity, "you are Samuel Harrington, the banker Daniel Stormwalker was investigating before he died." Harrington's face went pale. Blackwood smiled. "Ah," Blackwood said, "I see understanding dawning. Yes, Samuel here has been quite instrumental in our operation. Banking fraud, land schemes, the usual tools of acquisition in frontier territories. Daniel Stormwalker got too close to exposing the network, started asking dangerous questions, making dangerous connections." Thomas felt the world narrow to a single point of terrible focus. "What did you do?" Harrington found his voice, though it trembled. "Marshal Wilson, you must understand, business requires difficult decisions sometimes. Stormwalker was going to ruin everything, expose the land transfers, destroy years of careful planning. What did you do?" Thomas repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more menace than any shout. "Mountain fever is common in these territories," Harrington said, trying to sound reasonable. "Tragic but natural. The contaminated supplies were unfortunate but necessary." He never finished the sentence. Thomas moved without conscious thought, covering the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands closed around Harrington's throat, slamming the banker against the wall with enough force to crack plaster. "Not just Daniel," Thomas said, the words coming from somewhere deep and cold and absolutely certain. "Anna, my wife. She died of mountain fever 3 years ago, right after Daniel told me about the banking fraud, right after I started asking questions." Harrington's eyes went wide with terror and guilty recognition. The truth hit Thomas like a physical blow. 3 years of grief, 3 years believing it was natural tragedy. All a lie. "You killed her," Thomas whispered. "Poisoned my wife to protect your scheme." Guards moved to intervene, but Blackwood raised a hand, stopping them. "Let him have his moment of realization, gentlemen. It is the least we can offer." Thomas's vision had narrowed to a red tunnel. Every instinct screamed to squeeze, to feel Harrington's windpipe collapse, to deliver the justice that law and courts would take years to provide if they provided it at all. Vernon's voice echoed in memory. "Pride and anger are luxuries lawmen cannot afford." Anna's voice softer. "Promise me you will protect our family." James's face. 9 years old. Waiting. Trusting. Thomas released Harrington and stepped back. The banker collapsed, gasping and clutching his throat. Thomas's hands shook with the effort of control, but control held. "Very impressive, Marshal," Blackwood said, and his tone carried genuine respect. "Most men would have killed him, but you stopped. Professional discipline overriding personal rage. That is why I always admired you, even when we stood on opposite sides." Thomas turned to face him. "You want me to care about your admiration? You took a child." "I took leverage," Blackwood corrected. "Your nephew is safe and will remain so. In fact, I am prepared to release him immediately." Thomas went very still. "In exchange for what? Your cooperation and your silence." Blackwood gestured to the documents on the table. "At dawn, we finalize land transfers that will give us legal control of water rights across 3 counties, perfectly legal on paper, enforced by corrupt officials in our pocket. Once complete, we control settlement patterns for the next 20 years, shape the territory's future. By stealing from honest homesteaders. By bringing order to chaos, Marshal. The frontier is dying. The old ways, the free range, the lawless territories, all dying. What replaces them will be determined by men with vision and will. Men like me and Samuel. We are not outlaws. We are pioneers of a new economic order. You are thieves, murderers." Blackwood sighed. Such limited perspective, but I expected nothing else from a federal lapdog." He nodded to one of the guards. "Bring the boy." The minutes stretched. Thomas remained absolutely still, every sense alert for opportunity. The guards watched him with professional wariness. Roy Hastings avoided his gaze. Harrington slowly recovered his breathing, massaging his bruised throat. Then the door opened and they brought James in. The boy looked small and frightened, but unharmed. His eyes found Thomas immediately, and relief flooded his young face. "Uncle Thomas!" Every instinct screamed to move, to gather the boy, to run. But Thomas forced himself to remain still, to trust the plan, to believe that Vernon and Eli and Ayanna were in position and ready. "As you can see," Blackwood said, "the child is unharmed, frightened certainly, but unharmed. And he will leave here safely. I give you my word as an officer and a gentleman if you agree to my terms." "What terms?" "You witnessed nothing here tonight. You know nothing of our operation. You take the boy and return to Santa Fe, and we never speak of this again." Simple enough. Thomas looked at James, looked at Blackwood, looked at Harrington, who had killed Anna and Daniel, both for the sin of asking questions. Outside in the darkness, Vernon and Eli and Ayanna waited. 20 federal marshals staged at Widow's Pass. Justice positioned and ready. Inside this room, a 9-year-old boy waited to go home, trusting his uncle to save him. Thomas Wilson made his choice. "No deal," he said quietly. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Marshal, be reasonable." "No deal," Thomas repeated. "You will release James immediately and surrender yourself and Harrington to federal custody. Your men will lay down their weapons. The land fraud will be exposed and prosecuted, and you will face trial for everything you have done." Blackwood stared at him for 3 long heartbeats, then smiled. "You have backup out there after all, hidden well enough that my men missed them. Impressive." He raised his voice. "Guards full alert. We have federal forces approaching. Secure all prisoners and prepare defensive positions." The room exploded into motion, and in the chaos, Thomas Wilson moved toward his nephew, hoping his team was ready, praying his gamble would pay off, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice prevailed or whether the darkness won. The room erupted into controlled chaos. Guards moved with military precision weapons drawn, securing exits and windows. One grabbed James, pulling the boy away from Thomas before he could reach him. Another pressed a rifle barrel against Thomas's spine, hard enough to bruise. Blackwood remained perfectly still at the center of the storm, watching Thomas with the cold assessment of a chess master recognizing an opponent's gambit. "How many men do you have out there, Marshal?" Thomas said nothing. Every second of silence was a second for Vernon and Eli to reposition, a second for Ayanna to move on Sarah Morgan's location, a second closer to extraction. "No matter," Blackwood continued. "We have defensible positions and superior numbers. And we have the boy. Your people make one aggressive move, he dies. You understand this." Thomas understood it perfectly. Understood that Blackwood was not bluffing. Understood that the next few minutes would test every ounce of training and discipline he possessed. But he also understood something Blackwood did not. That outside in the darkness, Vernon Hastings was not just an old retired marshal. He was a tactical genius with 40 years of experience reading terrain and men, and he would have anticipated exactly this scenario. The window exploded inward, not breaking, not shattering, exploding as Vernon's precisely thrown rock struck the glass at exactly the right angle to send fragments flying inward rather than out. The old marshal's decades of frontier experience included knowing exactly how to create chaos from distance. The old marshal's decades of frontier experience included knowing exactly how to create chaos from distance. In that half-second of distraction, Thomas moved. He drove his elbow backward into the ribs of the guard behind him, feeling bone crack, then spun and took the man's rifle in a move that had been drilled into him during cavalry training 30 years prior. The weapon came free, and Thomas reversed it, using the stock to club the nearest guard across the jaw. 2 seconds, 2 guards down. But there were 3 more in the room, and they were recovering, bringing weapons to bear. Thomas had no cover, no advantage except surprise, and that was already spent. Then the door burst open, and Eli Carter came through it like violent poetry. The young marshal had clearly been positioned close, waiting for any opportunity. His first shot took the guard holding James a precise hit to the shoulder that dropped the man without killing him. The second shot shattered the oil lamp on the table, plunging half the room into darkness and shadow. "James, to me," Eli's voice cut through the chaos. The boy moved without hesitation, ducking low and running toward the marshal, who had appeared like something from a rescue tale. Eli caught him with one arm, pulling him behind a cover of the doorframe while returning fire with his other hand. Blackwood had drawn his own pistol, but did not fire. Instead, he moved with surprising speed toward the back exit, calling orders as he went. "Secure the documents, full defensive positions. Kill anyone who is not one of ours." Samuel Harrington was already running, grabbing the leather portfolio from the table, stuffing papers inside with shaking hands. His soft face had gone pale with terror. This was not the ordered, controlled transaction he had envisioned. This was frontier violence in its rawest form. Thomas fired once intentionally, high, sending Harrington diving for cover. The banker scrambled toward the same exit Blackwood had taken, clutching the portfolio like a lifeline. More guards were pouring into the compound now, drawn by gunfire. Thomas could hear shouting, running feet, the organized response of men who had drilled for exactly this contingency. Eli appeared at his side, James clutched against his chest. "Boss, we need to move now. Ayanna has extraction route clear through the East Ravine." Vernon, positioned on the ridge with the Winchester, providing cover. As if to punctuate the statement, a rifle shot cracked from high above. One of the guards rushing across the compound went down clutching his leg, not a killing shot. Vernon never killed when wounding would serve, but effective enough to scatter the advancing men and buy precious seconds. They ran. Thomas led, using his knowledge of the compound layout from the careful observation during his approach. Eli followed, carrying James with one arm while firing his pistol with the other to discourage pursuit. Behind them, the Broken Promise mine compound lit up like a disturbed anthill. The East Ravine was a natural cut in the plateau, narrow and steep-sided. Defensible if they could reach it. A death trap if they were caught in the open ground between here and there. Ayanna materialized from the darkness like an Apache spirit, Sarah Morgan beside her. The 2 women had clearly been waiting at the predetermined extraction point. Ayanna held a rifle. Sarah clutched a pack that Thomas hoped contained food and water for James. "This way?" Ayanna said, her voice calm despite the chaos behind them. "Apache trail leads down through the ravine. They will not follow. Too dark. Too dangerous." "They will follow," Thomas corrected. "Blackwood does not quit. Then we move fast enough that following does not matter." They plunged into the ravine. The walls rose on either side close enough to touch. The path descended at a stomach-churning angle, switching back on itself repeatedly. In daylight, this would be treacherous. In darkness, it was suicidal. But Ayanna led without hesitation, her feet finding purchase on stone that looked smooth and featureless to Thomas's eyes. Sarah followed close behind, then James, with Eli's hand on his shoulder. Thomas brought up the rear, stopping periodically to listen for pursuit. He heard it soon enough. Voices echoing down from the ravine entrance, the clink of metal on stone. Men following despite the danger. Thomas counted at least 6 separate voices. 6 men willing to risk broken necks on a midnight descent through broken terrain, either very brave or very afraid of what Blackwood would do if they let the prisoners escape. A rifle shot spanged off rock near Thomas's head, too close. The shooter had night-adapted eyes and enough skill to make targeting shots in near darkness. Professional. Dangerous. Thomas returned fire twice, aiming high, trying to slow rather than kill. His shots had the desired effect. The pursuit paused, taking cover, giving the escape party precious yards of distance. But the ravine could not last forever. Eventually, it would open to flatter ground, and there the pursuit would have advantage. Numbers and firepower against a small group protecting a child. They needed Vernon's backup, needed the 20 federal marshals Franklin had staged at Widow's Pass, needed something to shift the tactical balance. As if summoned by thought, Vernon's voice carried down from high above. "Tommy North Ridge, 3 minutes." Thomas understood immediately. Vernon had positioned himself to provide covering fire from a new angle. 3 minutes meant that was how long it would take him to traverse the ridge and reach the optimal sniping position. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. The ravine opened to a broader canyon. Not flat, but less vertical, the kind of terrain where running horses could operate. And there, picked out by starlight, Thomas saw them. The mounts they had left behind, plus 3 additional horses Ayanna had somehow retrieved and positioned. "Sarah takes James double on the mare," Ayanna said, already moving. "Eli and I on the pintos. Marshal Wilson on the gelding. We ride for Widow's Pass. Do not stop for anything." They mounted in controlled chaos. Thomas swung onto the gelding, feeling the animal's nervousness at all the violence and noise. James clung to Sarah Morgan, his young face streaked with tears, but determined. Brave boy, worthy of his father's memory. The pursuers emerged from the ravine mouth. 6 men, just as Thomas had counted. They had rifles and clear sight lines and every intention of using both. Vernon's Winchester spoke from the ridge above. 1 shot. 1 pursuer down, clutching his shoulder. Another shot. Another man stumbling. Not killing. Never killing, unless absolutely necessary, but effective enough to break their formation, and by seconds. "Ride," Thomas commanded. They rode hard through terrain that would have been dangerous at a walk. The horses, sensing their riders' urgency, gave everything they had. Hooves pounded against stone. Wind whipped past. Behind them, gunfire continued, but at this range and this speed, hitting a moving target was more luck than skill. The canyon narrowed ahead, funneling toward a natural bridge of stone that spanned a deep gorge. Devil's Backbone, the locals called it, the only passage north toward Widow's Pass without adding hours to the journey. Thomas saw the ambush before they reached it. 6 men positioned on either side of the bridge approach, professional spacing, overlapping fields of fire, waiting with the patience of soldiers who knew their business. Blackwood had anticipated the escape route, had positioned forces to cut off the most likely extraction path. Tactical brilliance that Thomas had to admire, even as it threatened to kill them all. Eli saw it too. "Boss, we are boxed." Thomas's mind raced through options. None good. Going back meant riding into the 6 pursuers behind them. Going forward meant charging directly into an ambush. Going around meant hours through unknown terrain with James exposed to cold and exhaustion. Then Ayanna was beside him, her voice urgent. "Marshal, trust me. There is another way." She veered hard left, away from the bridge toward what looked like a solid rock wall. Thomas followed because he had no better option, and because Daniel Stormwalker had trusted this woman with his life. The wall proved illusory. What had appeared solid from distance was actually a narrow cleft, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Ayanna plunged into it without hesitation. Sarah and James followed. Then Eli. Thomas brought up the rear just as the ambush forces opened fire. Bullets whined off stone, but the angle was wrong. The shooters had positioned for the bridge approach, not for targets disappearing into hidden passages. The cleft twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow that Thomas's legs scraped stone on both sides. Then it opened into a hidden canyon that ran parallel to the main passage. Apache trail, secret path. The kind of knowledge that could only come from generations of intimate terrain familiarity. They emerged onto the north side of Devil's Backbone, having bypassed the ambush entirely. Behind them, confused shouting indicated the pursuers trying to locate where their quarry had vanished. But they were not clear yet. More riders appeared ahead, coming fast from the direction of Widow's Pass. For one terrible moment, Thomas thought Blackwood had somehow gotten forces ahead of them. Then he saw the federal marshal badges catching moonlight. Franklin's men 20 strong riding in formation like cavalry. Vernon must have sent word to advance when the shooting started. Deputy Marshal Franklin pulled up alongside Thomas, his weathered face grim with professional concern. Wilson's status: boy is secure. Primary targets Blackwood and Harrington are still at the mine. We need to contain the compound and prevent escape. Already positioned. Got men cutting off the south and west routes. Franklin's expression darkened. Fair warning, though. One of Blackwood's lieutenants, Jake Morrison, is with them. Bank robber, killer, mean as a snake, and twice as dangerous. If shooting starts, he will not surrender easy. Thomas filed the name away. Noted. Your signal, we move in. Thomas looked back toward James being held by Sarah Morgan, being comforted by Eli's reassuring presence. The boy was safe. The primary objective achieved. Everything else was just cleaning up. But not everything. Because Samuel Harrington had fled with the documents that proved the land fraud conspiracy. And Ezra Blackwood remained free, dangerous, and possessed of resources and intelligence that made him more than just another outlaw. Move in, Thomas ordered. Secure all prisoners, but Blackwood and Harrington are mine. Franklin nodded understanding. Federal marshals did not question each other's jurisdiction, especially when family was involved. We will sweep the compound. You do what needs doing. Thomas turned to Eli. Get James to Margaret. Ride straight through to Cimarron. Do not stop. Do not engage. Just get him home. Eli hesitated. Boss, you will need backup. I have 20 federal marshals, and Vernon, and Mrs. Stormwalker, if she is willing. Thomas met the young marshal's eyes. James is the priority. Everything else is just justice catching up. Go. Eli recognized the tone, the finality of an order that would not be countermanded. He nodded once, then wheeled his horse and headed north with James and Sarah. Ayanna remained. Marshal, if you are hunting Blackwood, you need a tracker, and I have my own accounting with the man who stole Ember. It will be dangerous. I am Apache. Danger is Tuesday. Vernon appeared on his exhausted horse, the Winchester still smoking from repeated firing. Heard the plan. I am coming too. Not negotiable. Thomas looked at them. These people who had risked everything for a boy they barely knew, and a cause that was not originally theirs, felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight since Anna died. He was not alone anymore, had not been alone for a while. He had just been too proud or too scared to acknowledge it. Then let us finish this, Thomas said. They turned back toward the Broken Promise mine where Ezra Blackwood waited with honor and madness intertwined, and where Samuel Harrington cowered with blood money and documents that could destroy him. The hunt was entering its final phase. And Thomas Wilson intended to see it through to the end, no matter what that end might be. Dawn broke cold and pale over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as Thomas Wilson watched Deputy Marshal Franklin's forces sweep through the Broken Promise Mine compound. The operation unfolded with the precise efficiency of federal law enforcement at its finest. Guards surrendered or fled. Documents were seized. The carefully constructed facade of Blackwood's operation crumbled under the weight of 20 armed marshals executing warrants, but 2 men were missing from the hall. Ezra Blackwood and Samuel Harrington had vanished into the network of canyons and hidden trails that webbed through the high country like veins through stone. Thomas stood with Vernon and Ayanna on the eastern ridge, studying the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had tracked men through worse country than this. Below, Franklin coordinated the arrests and evidence collection. The corrupt Deputy Roy Hastings sat in chains, his face a mask of resignation and defeat. Other gang members were being cataloged and processed, justice grinding forward with bureaucratic inevitability. But the real prizes had escaped. Tracks head southeast, Ayanna said, crouched low over barely visible signs in the rocky soil. 2 horses, one carrying heavy weight. Documents probably. They left maybe 20 minutes ago, moving fast but not reckless. Vernon studied the terrain through his field glasses. Southeast takes them toward Widow's Canyon. Dead end unless they know the hidden trails through to the New Mexico border. Blackwood knows them, Thomas said with certainty. He has been operating in this territory for months. He will have escape routes mapped and staged. Ayanna stood brushing dust from her hands. Widow's Canyon is Apache territory. My people know every stone and spring. If Blackwood is there, we will find him. Thomas felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Franklin had men enough to handle the compound. The priority now was preventing Blackwood and Harrington from escaping with the evidence that could implicate dozens of corrupt officials across 3 territories. Evidence that could reshape land ownership and water rights for a generation. And evidence that proved Samuel Harrington had ordered the deaths of Daniel Stormwalker and Anna Wilson. The thought of Anna brought a familiar ache. 3 years since mountain fever took her. 3 years of believing it was random tragedy, natural death in an unnatural land. Now knowing it was murder, calculated, deliberate, the cost of asking too many questions and getting too close to inconvenient truths. Vernon touched his shoulder, the old marshal's eyes, knowing. Tommy, I see that look, the one that worries me. You need to promise me something before we ride after them. What promise? That when we find Harrington, and we will find him, you let the law handle it. Trial. Jury. Proper execution, if it comes to that. Not frontier justice delivered by an angry widower. Thomas wanted to make that promise. Wanted to be the man Vernon had trained him to be. The lawman who believed in process and procedure and the civilizing influence of institutional justice. But he could not lie to Vernon. Not after 30 years of friendship and partnership. I will try, Thomas said. That is all I can promise. Vernon studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I suppose that will have to be enough, but I am riding with you specifically to make sure trying becomes doing. Understood? Understood. Ayanna was already moving toward the horses. If we leave now, we can catch them before they reach the canyon narrows. After that, terrain favors defense, and we lose our advantage. They rode hard through country that got progressively rougher as elevation increased. The trail Blackwood and Harrington had taken threaded through broken stone and twisted pine, following paths that only someone with intimate terrain knowledge would attempt. Ayanna led reading sign that was invisible to Thomas's trained but Anglo eyes. Vernon brought up the rear, the old man sitting his horse with the easy competence of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than out of it. An hour into the pursuit, Ayanna raised a hand and reined to a stop. She dismounted, studying something on the ground with intense focus. When she looked up, her expression was troubled. They split up. Blackwood went south toward the high passes. Harrington continued east into Widow's Canyon. Thomas felt cold certainty settle in his gut. Blackwood is drawing pursuit away from Harrington, sacrificing his own escape to protect the documents. Or protecting his banker, Vernon suggested. Man like Blackwood operates on strange codes of honor. Might feel obligated to the partner who financed his operation. Ayanna pointed to the southeast trail. Harrington is alone, one horse, moving slower now. He does not know this country. Will be easy to track. Thomas made the tactical calculation quickly. Blackwood was dangerous, but not the primary target. The documents were. The evidence that could expose the conspiracy and prevent future crimes. That had to take precedence over personal vendettas. We follow Harrington, Thomas decided. Take the documents. Blackwood can wait. They found him 3 hours later. Widow's Canyon lived up to its ominous name. The walls rose sheer and hostile on either side, closing off the sky to a narrow ribbon of blue. Water ran cold and clear through the center, fed by springs that never quite froze even in the deepest winter. It was beautiful country in a harsh, unforgiving way. The kind of place that killed careless travelers and rewarded those who understood its moods. Samuel Harrington understood nothing about this country. That much was obvious from how badly he had positioned himself. He had ridden to the canyon's dead end, a box of stone walls with no exit except the way he had entered. Now he sat on a boulder beside his exhausted horse, the leather portfolio clutched to his chest like a talisman, his expensive clothes torn and muddy from the hard ride. He saw them coming and did something that might have been brave or might have been desperate stupidity. He drew a small caliber pistol from his coat and pointed it with shaking hands. "Stay back," his voice echoed off the canyon walls, high and frightened. "I am warning you. I will shoot." Thomas Vernon and Ayanna reined to a stop 50 yards out, well beyond effective pistol range. Thomas raised his hand slowly, making no threatening moves. "Mr. Harrington, it is over. Put down the weapon, surrender the documents, face trial like a civilized man." "Trial?" Harrington's laugh was bitter and broken. "You think I will get a fair trial? You think anyone cares about due process when territorial politics are involved?" He shook his head. "I hang either way. At least this way I die on my own terms." Vernon edged his horse forward slightly. "Son, nobody needs to die here today. We take you into custody, you testify against the other conspirators, maybe the court shows mercy." "Mercy," Harrington spat the word. "The same mercy you showed the Confederates after the war. The same mercy the federal government shows anyone who dares to build something outside their control." Thomas felt his patience fraying. Every second of delay was a second Blackwood could use to escape. Every minute of negotiation was a minute James's trauma went unaddressed. This soft banker, this murderer in gentleman's clothing, deserved nothing but the swift justice of a rope. But Vernon's eyes were on him, watching, waiting to see if 30 years of training would hold against 3 years of grief. Thomas took a careful breath. "You ordered the death of Daniel Stormwalker, a good man, a honest man. You had him poisoned because he discovered your fraud." Harrington's face went pale. "I never wanted that. Blackwood assured me it would be handled quietly. Accidents happen on the frontier. I did not know he meant poison until after, and my wife." Thomas's voice had gone very quiet, very cold. "Anna Wilson. She died 3 years ago. Mountain fever, the doctor said. But it was poison, was it not? Because I started investigating the same fraud Daniel had discovered." Harrington said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. Ayanna spoke softly from her position. "Marshal, let me take him. Let me take. Apache justice is sometimes more appropriate than white man's law." The offer was tempting. Thomas could let Ayanna handle this, could claim later that the banker tried to escape, that unfortunate things happened in rough country, that justice took its own course. Vernon would know the truth, would know Thomas had chosen revenge over law, would be disappointed in ways that cut deeper than any reprimand. And somewhere Anna's spirit would know too, would know that her husband had failed the principles she had believed in, the codes that made civilization possible even on the frontier's edge. "Mr. Harrington," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the rage churning beneath. "You have one chance. Put down the weapon. Hand over the documents. Come peacefully. Or I will take you by force, and I promise you will not enjoy the experience." "I told you," Harrington said, his voice rising toward hysteria. "I am not going to hang. I am not going to—" The gunshot came from behind them, not from any of their weapons, from higher up, from the canyon rim, where a figure had appeared silently, moving with the practiced stealth of a trained soldier. Ezra Blackwood stood on the rim with a rifle, the barrel pointed not at Thomas or his companions, but at Samuel Harrington. "Put down the pistol, Samuel," Blackwood called down. "This charade has gone on long enough." Harrington spun, his face going from pale to ashen. "Major, what are you doing? You said you would protect me. You promised—" "I promised to get you to Mexico safely if you held up your end of the bargain." Blackwood's voice carried the cold disappointment of an officer dealing with a subordinate's failure. "You panicked, ran poorly, got yourself trapped like an amateur. I cannot protect incompetence. You cannot just leave me. I am not leaving you. I am giving you to the marshal, with my compliments." Blackwood shifted his attention to Thomas. "Marshal Wilson, we need to talk. You and I, without the banker muddying the waters." Thomas studied the situation rapidly. Blackwood had the high ground and the rifle, had clear shots on all of them, could kill at least two before they could take cover. But he was not shooting, was not threatening, was instead offering something that sounded suspiciously like negotiation. "What do you want, Blackwood? I want what you want, Marshall. Justice." "Just a different variety." Blackwood gestured with the rifle barrel toward Harrington. "That man is a coward and a schemer. He financed my operation, yes, but he also exceeded his authority, ordered murders I never sanctioned, used methods I never approved. You expect me to believe you are innocent? I expect you to believe I am guilty of many things, but not murder." Blackwood's voice carried absolute conviction. "I am a soldier. I fight enemies who can fight back. I do not poison women in their beds." Vernon called up his old voice steady. "If that is true, why run? Why not surrender and face trial? Because trials are political theater, old man. I know how they end. The victors write history, and I was on the losing side of the war. Any trial I face is predetermined." Blackwood paused. "But I can help you bring down the real criminals, the ones who hide behind law and banking and politics, the ones who make men like me necessary by creating the very chaos they claim to oppose." It was a strange offer. An enemy proposing alliance against a mutual foe. Thomas had seen it before during the war when battlefield necessities created temporary partnerships between men who would be shooting at each other again come morning. But that did not make it any less dangerous. "You have the documents," Thomas said, "the evidence we need. Hand them over and we can discuss terms." "I do not have them. Samuel does." Blackwood smiled without humor. "Which is why I am giving him to you, free of charge. Consider it a gesture of good faith." Harrington made a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. "You cannot do this. We had a partnership, an agreement. We had a business arrangement that you violated through excessive methods and moral cowardice. The arrangement is void." Blackwood shifted his rifle slightly. "Marshal Wilson, I am going to count to 3. On 3, Samuel will throw the portfolio to you. Then you and your people will withdraw 50 yards while I climb down and have a conversation with the banker. After that conversation, you may have him, unharmed and ready to testify. Do we have an accord?" Thomas looked at Vernon. The old marshal's face was troubled but considering, looked at Ayanna. The Apache woman's expression was unreadable. "What guarantee do we have you will not kill him the moment we withdraw?" Thomas asked. "My word as an officer, which I realize means little to you given our history, but it is all I have to offer." The seconds stretched. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled hunting. The cold wind that perpetually haunted these mountains whispered through the canyon. Thomas made his decision. "Agreed. On 3. Blackwood began counting. 1. Harrington clutched the portfolio tighter, his face a mask of betrayal and terror. 2. Thomas signaled Vernon and Ayanna to ready for withdrawal. Both moved their horses into position. 3. Harrington threw the portfolio. It sailed through the air, pages fluttering, and landed at the feet of Thomas's horse. Vernon was off his mount, instantly securing the documents with quick efficiency. Thomas and his people withdrew the agreed distance, watched as Blackwood scrambled down the canyon wall with the agility of someone who had spent months learning these trails. Watched as he approached Harrington with rifle lowered but ready. What happened next, Thomas could not hear clearly. The two men spoke in voices too low to carry. Harrington gestured wildly, pleading. Blackwood remained still as carved stone. Then something changed. Harrington's hand moved toward his coat, toward the pistol he had not surrendered. Blackwood was faster. His rifle came up in one smooth motion. Thomas shouted a warning, but the distance was too great and the action too sudden. The shot echoed through Widow's Canyon like judgment itself. Samuel Harrington fell, clutching his chest. Surprise frozen on his soft features. Fell and did not rise. Blackwood stood over the body for a moment, then looked across the distance to where Thomas sat his horse. "He drew on me," Blackwood called. "You saw it. Self-defense under any law you care to name. Thomas had seen it, had seen Harrington's hand move toward the pistol, had seen the threat that made Blackwood's response, while brutal, technically justified. But justified and right were not always the same thing. Vernon was already moving, riding hard toward the scene despite the risk. Thomas and Ayanna followed, guns drawn but not aimed, ready for betrayal. Blackwood made no threatening moves, simply stood beside Harrington's body rifle, pointed at the ground, waiting. They reached him together. Vernon dismounted and checked Harrington's pulse, then shook his head. The banker was dead. The man who had ordered Anna's death, the man who had poisoned Daniel, dead before trial, before testimony, before justice could run its full course. Thomas should have felt satisfaction, should have felt that some measure of vengeance had been served. Instead, he felt empty. Blackwood watched him with knowing eyes. "Not how you wanted it to end. I understand. You are a man of law and process. You wanted trials and testimony and the civilized machinery of justice grinding him to dust." He paused. "But sometimes the frontier delivers its own justice. Faster, messier, but no less final." "You killed him deliberately," Thomas said quietly. "Pushed him to draw so you could claim self-defense." "I gave him a choice. He made it poorly." Blackwood shouldered his rifle. "The documents are yours. The testimony you need from the other conspirators will come easy now that their banker cannot contradict them. You will get your convictions and your reforms and your satisfying conclusion. And you, I am going to Mexico, going to disappear into the territories where federal authority is a suggestion rather than a certainty, going to rebuild." Blackwood met Thomas's eyes. "But before I go, I want you to know something. I did not order those murders, would never have approved them. Samuel Harrington was useful, but ultimately weak. Weak men do terrible things when they panic." Vernon stepped forward, his old voice carrying steel. "You expect us to just let you walk away? After everything you have done, I expect you to recognize that I just solved your biggest problem. Harrington is dead, cannot flee jurisdiction, cannot recant testimony, cannot be rescued by corrupt officials. You have your evidence and your closure." Blackwood looked at Thomas. "And you have something else. The knowledge that Anna's killer faced justice. Maybe not the justice you wanted, but justice nonetheless." Thomas felt the weight of the Colt at his hip, felt how easy it would be to draw, to end this here and now, to bring in Ezra Blackwood dead or alive, preferably dead, and close this chapter with blood and finality. But he thought about James safe now with his mother, thought about Eli riding through dawn light with a rescued child, thought about Anna, who had believed in law even when law failed her. "Go," Thomas said quietly. Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "Marshal, go to Mexico, disappear, build whatever new life you think you deserve." Thomas's voice was cold as mountain wind. "But know this. If you ever cross back into United States territory, if you ever threaten another innocent person, if I ever hear your name connected to criminal activity again, I will hunt you personally. And next time there will be no conversation, no negotiation, just an ending." Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Understood. And, Marshal, for what it is worth, I am sorry about your wife, truly. She deserved better than the cards she was dealt." He turned and walked toward his horse with the measured dignity of a man who had accepted exile. Vernon grabbed Thomas's arm. "Tommy, we cannot just let him go. He is wanted on a dozen warrants. We have Harrington's body and documents. We have enough to prosecute the conspiracy. Blackwood is a loose end, a dangerous one, but sometimes you have to choose which battles matter most." Ayanna was searching through the documents Vernon had retrieved, her face growing darker with each page. "Marshal, you need to see this." Thomas took the papers she offered. "Read them once, then again more slowly. Land deeds for Eagle's Nest Canyon, Ayanna's homestead. Fraudulent debt papers claiming Daniel Stormwalker owed money to Harrington Bank. Legal documents that would have stripped Ayanna of everything her husband had built. All signed by Samuel Harrington, all dated to take effect the day after the meeting at Broken Promise Mine. "He was going to take your land," Thomas said quietly. "Everything Daniel built, everything you have left." Ayanna's hands were steady as she took the papers back and fed them one by one into the small fire Vernon had started. "Then it is good he is dead, because I would have killed him myself eventually." They watched the fraudulent documents burn, watched justice of a sort being served, even if it was not the justice Thomas had envisioned. Above them, on the canyon rim, Ezra Blackwood disappeared into the high country, riding toward Mexico, and whatever future awaited, exiled Confederate officers with too much pride and too many ghosts. Thomas Wilson let him go. Because sometimes the law could only do so much. Sometimes frontier justice filled the gaps that civilization left. And sometimes a man had to choose between perfect justice and good enough. He chose good enough and prayed it would be sufficient. Ezra Blackwood had ridden perhaps 20 yards when the sound stopped him. Not gunfire, not pursuit. Something else. The distant thunder of many horses moving fast through rough country. He reined to a halt and turned in the saddle, his military bearing still evident despite months as a fugitive. His eyes found Thomas across the distance. "Marshal," Blackwood called, "we have company incoming, a lot of company, and I suspect they are not your federal backup." Thomas heard it now, too. A dozen horses at least, maybe more, coming from the west, from the direction of the Broken Promise Mine. He exchanged glances with Vernon, saw the same tactical assessment forming in the old marshal's mind. "Blackwood's remaining gang members," Vernon said quietly, "coming to rescue their boss or recover the documents." Ayanna was already scanning the canyon rims, reading the terrain with Apache expertise. "We are in a bad position. Canyon walls trap us. Only one exit, and they are coming from that direction. If they have rifles and take the high ground, we die here." Thomas made rapid calculations, 3 of them against a dozen or more hardened outlaws, poor terrain, limited ammunition, and Samuel Harrington's body lying as evidence that could not be abandoned without raising questions about exactly how the banker died. Blackwood rode back toward them, his face grim. "Marshal Wilson, I propose a temporary truce. My men are coming, yes. But they are coming because Roy Hastings sent word before your people arrested him. Told them to recover the documents at any cost and eliminate all witnesses." "Including you?" Thomas asked. "I am an impediment now, a liability who knows too much and cannot be controlled." Blackwood dismounted, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Hastings has been playing both sides, taking my money while reporting to someone higher up the corruption chain. Someone who wants those documents destroyed and everyone involved dead." Vernon kept his rifle trained on Blackwood despite the approaching threat. "And we should trust you because you have no choice, old man, and because honor, even twisted frontier honor, demands I not let my former men murder lawmen in cold blood." Blackwood took a position behind a boulder, sighting down his rifle. "I will help you survive the next 10 minutes. After that we can resume our respective roles as hunter and hunted." Thomas weighed the options in the 3 seconds he had available. Trust a Confederate outlaw who had spent months evading federal law, or face a dozen killers with only Vernon and Ayanna as backup. The decision was easier than it should have been. "Ayanna, take the east wall. Vernon west. Blackwood and I will hold the center." Thomas moved into position, using Harrington's body for cover in a grim piece of practical warfare. "Fire only on my command. Make every shot count." The riders appeared at the canyon entrance moments later. Thomas counted 14 men, all heavily armed, moving with the coordinated discipline that marked Blackwood's training. But their formation was too aggressive, too confident. The formation of men who expected to overwhelm rather than outfight. Their leader was a thick-shouldered man Thomas recognized from wanted posters. Jake Morrison, bank robber, killer, the kind of outlaw who made other outlaws nervous. Morrison pulled up 50 yards out, studying the defensive position with professional wariness. His eyes found Blackwood first, then moved to Thomas. "Major," Morrison called. "Hastings sent word you might need extraction. Seems the marshal here has caused some complications." "I need no extraction, Jake," Blackwood replied, his cultured voice carrying across the distance. "The situation is under control." "Is it now?" Morrison's smile was ugly. "Because from where I sit, you are trapped in a box canyon with federal law, and we have orders to make sure certain documents never see the inside of a courtroom." "Whose orders? Does it matter? Money is money." Morrison gestured to his men, who began spreading out to flank positions. "We are going to kill the marshal and his people. Take the documents. Then you and I are going to have a conversation about how leadership of this operation gets restructured." Blackwood went very still. "You are attempting a coup, Jake. I am attempting to survive. You have gotten sloppy, Major. Let personal honor interfere with business. That ends now." The next few seconds moved with the compressed intensity of violence barely contained. Morrison's men continued their flanking movement. Thomas tracked the nearest target through his rifle sights, felt Vernon doing the same from his position, heard Ayanna's controlled breathing as she picked her shot, and beside him, Ezra Blackwood made a choice. "Jake," Blackwood said quietly, "I trained you better than this, taught you that loyalty matters, that codes, even outlaw codes, hold men together when law cannot. You taught me that winners make rules and losers follow them. Right now you are looking like a loser." Blackwood sighed. Then he shifted his rifle and shot Jake Morrison's horse out from under him. Not Morrison himself, the horse. A deliberate choice that sent the outlaw leader sprawling into dirt but left him alive and unharmed. A move that was tactically questionable but honorably precise. The canyon exploded into gunfire. Thomas fired 3 times in rapid succession, each shot carefully placed to wound rather than kill. He hit 2 men, saw them go down, clutching shoulders and legs. Vernon's Winchester cracked with metronomic precision, the old marshal proving that age had not dulled his marksmanship. 3 more outlaws fell. Ayanna fired from her position with Apache efficiency, making every bullet count. 2 shots, 2 men down. And Blackwood fought beside them like the cavalry officer he had once been calling targets, and coordinating fire with the tactical brilliance that had made him dangerous. Vernon 3 riders flanking west. Ayanna suppressed the rim positions, Marshal Wilson with me on the center approach. They fought as a unit despite being enemies, fought with the strange synchronicity of professional soldiers who understood battlefield necessity, transcended personal grievance. Morrison's men, caught between superior position and superior skill, began to break. Some fled, some surrendered. The smart ones did both simultaneously. Morrison himself stood with hands raised, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You sided with federal law against your own men. I sided with honor against treachery," Blackwood replied coldly. "There is a difference, though I suspect you are too small-minded to comprehend it." The fight had lasted perhaps 5 minutes. 8 outlaws down, wounded but alive. 6 fled into the mountains. Morrison stood alone, disarmed and defeated. Vernon kept his rifle trained on the surrendered men while Ayanna gathered weapons. Thomas approached Blackwood, who stood reloading his rifle with careful deliberation. "You could have escaped during the fight," Thomas said. "Could have used the chaos to disappear." "I could have." Blackwood finished loading and shouldered the rifle. "But that would have been dishonorable. We had a truce. Truces mean something even on the frontier." They stood in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by groaning wounded and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The documents lay secure in Vernon's saddlebag. Harrington's body lay as mute testimony to frontier justice, and between Thomas Wilson and Ezra Blackwood stretched 13 years of history grievance, and the strange respect that sometimes forms between worthy adversaries. "Major Blackwood," Thomas said formally. I am placing you under arrest for escape from territorial custody and conspiracy to commit fraud. You will be transported to Santa Fe for trial." Blackwood met his eyes steadily. "And if I refuse, then we fight, here and now, and one of us does not leave this canyon alive." The silence stretched. Vernon watched with his finger on the trigger. Ayanna had moved into position to provide crossfire if needed. Morrison and his surviving men watched with the morbid fascination of men witnessing their world's end. Blackwood smiled. Not the cold, tactical smile of earlier, something softer, almost sad. "Marshal Wilson, Thomas. May I call you Thomas?" "No." "Marshal Wilson, then. I have spent 13 years running from the consequences of a war I did not start and a cause that was doomed before it began. 13 years building empires from crime because legitimate society wanted no part of a defeated Confederate officer." He paused. "I am tired, Marshal, tired of running, tired of building things that inevitably collapse, tired of being the villain in someone else's story of civilization's triumph." "Then surrender. Face trial. Let justice run its course." "Justice." Blackwood tasted the word. "Do you know what justice looks like for men like me? A show trial, predetermined verdict. Execution as public spectacle to prove the federal government's authority." He shook his head. "That is not justice. That is theater." Thomas felt Vernon watching him, felt the weight of decision settling onto shoulders that had carried too many such weights over too many years. "I will testify on your behalf," Thomas heard himself say. "Will tell the court you fought beside federal marshals against your own men, that you showed honor when you could have shown treachery, that you deserve consideration for those actions." Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "You would do that for me. I would do that for the truth, which is that men are more than their worst choices, and that redemption, even partial redemption, deserves acknowledgement." Silence again. Wind whispered through the canyon. Somewhere a wounded horse whickered softly. Blackwood unbuckled his gun belt, let it drop to the ground with deliberate ceremony, placed his rifle across his saddle, raised his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. "Very well, Marshal. I accept your arrest and your offer of testimony." He paused. "Though I suspect the court will care little for the words of one lawman speaking for one outlaw." Vernon moved forward with manacles approaching Blackwood with the cautious respect of someone who had seen too many surrenders turn violent. "Major, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Blackwood complied. Turned slowly. Let Vernon secure the manacles with professional tightness, checking each lock twice. And then with his hands supposedly bound and his weapons surrendered, Ezra Blackwood made one final choice. His right hand twisted with sudden violence, thumb dislocating with an audible pop, as he used an old Confederate escape technique, pulling free from the steel restraint. Pain meant nothing. Honor demanded one last stand. His freed hand moved with cavalry-trained speed toward the derringer hidden in his boot. Vernon saw it first, shouted warning, brought the Winchester up with reflexes that defied his 68 years. The shot cracked with precision that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Not a killing shot, not even a wounding shot in the conventional sense. Vernon's bullet struck the derringer in Blackwood's hand, sending the small weapon spinning away with numbing force, but leaving Blackwood's hand intact. Blackwood stood frozen, staring at his empty hand, at the mangled derringer lying in dust, at Vernon, who held the Winchester steady with smoke still curling from the barrel. "That was the finest shot I have ever witnessed," Blackwood said quietly, "and I have witnessed considerable shooting in my time." Vernon lowered the rifle slowly. "I trained Tommy to shoot for precision, not for killing. Figured I should practice what I preach." Thomas moved forward, resecuring the manacles properly this time. Checked Blackwood for additional weapons with thoroughness that bordered on excessive. Found none. "Why?" Thomas asked. "You had surrendered. You had my word about testimony. Why throw it away?" Blackwood met his eyes, and Thomas saw something broken there, something that had perhaps been broken for 13 years. Because I could not do it, Marshal, could not walk into a courtroom in chains, could not let them parade me as an example, could not give them that satisfaction. His voice was barely a whisper. I thought dying fighting would be preferable to living defeated. But your friend's marksmanship has removed that option. Honor does not demand you die fighting, Thomas said. Honor demands you face consequences like a man, accept responsibility, make what amends you can before the end. Is that what your honor demands? That is what honor itself demands, real honor, not the twisted version we use to justify violence. They stood in Widow's Canyon as the sun climbed toward noon, surrounded by wounded outlaws and dead dreams and the complicated aftermath of frontier justice. Vernon supervised the binding of Morrison and the other prisoners. Ayanna recovered her stolen mare from the outlaws' string of horses, reuniting with Ember with quiet Apache prayers of gratitude. And Thomas Wilson stood with the man who had evaded him for months, captured at last, not through superior force, but through the strange alchemy of honor and exhaustion, and the recognition that running forever was its own kind of death. Marshal, Blackwood said, I have one request before we begin the journey to Santa Fe. What request? Let me bury Samuel Harrington properly. He was a weak man and a murderer, but he was my partner. Deserves better than being left for scavengers. Thomas considered. Thought about Anna buried in Santa Fe with full ceremony despite dying alone. Thought about Daniel laid to rest with Apache and Christian rites combined. Thought about how the dead deserved dignity even when the living had forfeited it. 20 minutes, Thomas said. We bury him properly. Then we ride for Santa Fe and whatever justice awaits there. They buried Samuel Harrington in Widow's Canyon with no words spoken and no prayers offered. Just the simple act of returning him to earth, the banker who had ordered murders from behind a desk, who had died by his own cowardice and Blackwood's ruthlessness, who would face no earthly trial, but whose crimes were documented in the papers now secured as evidence. When it was done, Thomas helped Blackwood onto his horse despite the manacles, secured the chain to the saddle horn with professional efficiency. Vernon and Ayanna mounted up, herding the captured outlaws into a sullen line. Marshal Wilson, Blackwood said as they prepared to ride, Do you believe in redemption truly? Thomas thought about the question, about James safe with his mother because violent men had done violent things in his rescue, about Anna avenged not by law, but by frontier justice, about himself, a lawman who had bent rules and made compromises and let an enemy escape because the alternative felt wrong. I believe in consequences, Thomas said finally, and I believe men can face those consequences with dignity. That is as close to redemption as the frontier offers. Then I will settle for consequences faced with dignity. They rode out of Widow's Canyon as afternoon shadows lengthened. Behind them lay bodies buried and evidence secured. Ahead lay Santa Fe and trials, and the slow machinery of institutional justice grinding toward whatever conclusions awaited. Ezra Blackwood rode in chains, but with his head high. The Confederate officer who had spent 13 years running had finally stopped, not because he was caught, but because he chose to stop. And Thomas Wilson rode beside him, wondering if that choice made Blackwood a better man or simply a tired one, wondering if in the end the difference mattered at all. The federal courthouse in Santa Fe was built of adobe and timber, designed to project authority in a territory that still remembered when Spanish law held sway. On a cold February morning in 1879, 3 months after the events at Widow's Canyon, Thomas Wilson sat in the witness box and told the truth about Ezra Blackwood, not the comfortable truth that courtrooms preferred, not the simple narrative of lawman versus outlaw civilization versus chaos, the complicated truth of a Confederate officer who had committed crimes but also saved lives, who had betrayed trusts but honored codes, who deserved punishment but also recognition. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious territorial attorney named Harrison, paced before the jury with theatrical precision. "Marshal Wilson, you are asking this court to show leniency to a man who escaped from federal custody, organized a criminal conspiracy, and evaded justice for months. Why?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "Because he fought beside federal marshals when he could have escaped. Because he surrendered when he could have died fighting. Because honor, even imperfect honor, deserves acknowledgement. Honor among thieves, Marshal. Honor among men, Counselor, which matters more than you might think in country where law is still being written." The trial lasted 6 days. Testimony from Vernon Hastings about the firefight in Widow's Canyon. From Ayanna Stormwalker about the land fraud conspiracy. From captured gang members who turned evidence to save themselves. From Roy Hastings, the corrupt deputy who had found unexpected redemption in cooperation. Roy had broken completely after his arrest. Had testified against the network of corrupt officials who had enabled Blackwood's operation. Had named names and provided documents and shown the kind of comprehensive betrayal that only an inside man could deliver. The territorial governor had fallen. 3 judges resigned. A dozen businessmen faced fraud charges, all because one corrupt deputy decided that redemption was preferable to hanging. Blackwood himself testified on the final day, stood in the dock with quiet dignity, and answered every question with the candor of someone who had accepted his fate. Yes, he had organized the conspiracy. Yes, he had evaded federal custody. No, he had not ordered the murders. That had been Harrington's doing, unauthorized and excessive. The documents proved it. It's proved. Letters in Harrington's hand ordering the poisoning of Daniel Stormwalker. Financial records showing payments to a merchant who had sold contaminated supplies to Anna Wilson. Evidence that Blackwood had discovered these actions only after the fact and had confronted Harrington about exceeding his authority. Too little, too late. But evidence, nonetheless, that not all crimes had been equally shared. The jury deliberated for 8 hours, returned with a verdict that surprised no one. Guilty on all charges except murder. The judge, a stern man named Pemberton, who had presided over territorial justice for 2 decades, looked down from the bench with the weathered face of someone who had seen every variety of frontier crime. "Ezra Blackwood, this court finds you guilty of escape from federal custody conspiracy to commit fraud, theft, and numerous lesser charges. However, in consideration of your cooperation with federal marshals and your surrender when escape remained possible, this court is inclined toward measured sentencing." Blackwood stood straight, hands clasped behind his back. "I accept the court's judgment, Your Honor. You are hereby sentenced to 40 years in federal territorial prison, eligible for parole review after 20 years served contingent on continued good behavior and cooperation." Pemberton's gavel fell with finality. "May God have mercy on your soul, Major Blackwood." 40 years. Blackwood was 56, would be 76 at earliest possible release. An old man if he survived. A broken one regardless. As the marshals led him from the courtroom, Blackwood paused beside Thomas. "Marshal Wilson, thank you for your testimony. It mattered even if the outcome was inevitable." "Will you accept visitors in prison?" Thomas asked. Blackwood's eyebrows rose. "You would visit me. I would check periodically that you are being treated according to law. That honor extends both directions." A brief smile crossed Blackwood's weathered face. "Then I accept. And Marshal raise young James well. He has the potential to be twice the lawman you are, which is saying something." They led him away in chains. Thomas watched until he disappeared through the courthouse doors, then turned to find Vernon waiting in the gallery. "You did good in there, Tommy," Vernon said quietly. "Told the truth even when it was uncomfortable. That takes courage." He deserved an honest accounting. "Most men do. Few get it." Vernon clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on. Your sister and nephew are waiting outside. Time to remember what we fought for." Margaret Wilson stood on the courthouse steps with James beside her, both bundled against the February cold. When James saw Thomas, he broke free and ran colliding with his uncle in a hug that carried 3 months of pent-up emotion. "Uncle Thomas, Mama said you testified for the bad man." "Why?" Thomas knelt to his nephew's level. "Because he was not entirely bad, James, just mostly bad with some good mixed in. And in this country we try to be fair even to people we do not like." "But he helped take me." "He did. And he is going to prison for a very long time because of it. But he also helped save you in the end. That complexity is important to understand." James considered this with the serious expression of a 9-year-old wrestling with moral philosophy. "So people can be good and bad at the same time. Most people are sun. Very few are purely one or the other." Margaret approached, her eyes red but clear. "Thomas, thank you for everything, for getting my boy back, for keeping your promises." "I failed Anna," Thomas said quietly. "Was not going to fail you too. Anna's death was not your fault. We know that now. Harrington murdered her. That knowledge does not bring her back, but it lifts the guilt you have been carrying." Thomas stood still, holding James's hand, looked at his sister, at his nephew, at the family he had nearly lost through his own absence and someone else's malice. "I am going to be around more. Do better about balancing duty and family. James deserves an uncle who is present, not just a legend who rides through occasionally." "I would like that," Margaret said. "We both would." The years that followed proved Thomas Wilson meant what he said. In 1880, he accepted a promotion to Regional Chief Marshal and used his expanded authority to establish something unprecedented in territorial law enforcement: the Federal Marshal Training Academy, a formal institution for teaching the next generation of lawmen everything he and Vernon had learned through hard experience. Elijah Carter became the lead instructor, teaching tracking and tactics to young men who thought carrying a badge made them invincible. Vernon Hastings, technically retired, taught case law and ethics, and the difference between justice and revenge. Thomas himself taught leadership and the complicated art of knowing when rules should bend. James visited the academy every summer, watching wide-eyed as men trained for the same work his uncle did. Thomas made time for those visits, made time for teaching the boy to ride and shoot and think like a lawman, made time for the relationship he had failed to build with Anna before she died. In 1885, James Wilson enrolled in the academy at 16, not because Thomas pressured him, because the boy had decided for himself that law enforcement was a calling worth pursuing. He graduated top of his class 2 years later, pinned on a deputy marshal's badge at 18, proved himself worthy of it through competence and courage over the next 8 years. Thomas retired in 1890 at age 67, his body worn down by decades of hard riding and harder choices. Passed his badge to Eli Carter in a simple ceremony attended by marshals from 3 territories. Moved to a small house in Santa Fe where he could watch the mountains and remember the men he had hunted and the men he had saved, and the complicated tally of a life spent enforcing law in country that was only beginning to understand what law meant. Vernon Hastings died peacefully in 1892, surrounded by former students and the respect of everyone who had known him. They buried him with full federal honors. Thomas spoke at the funeral, his voice breaking only once when he said, "He taught me that being a lawman was about wisdom, not weapons, about patience, not pride. I am a better man for having known him." Eli Carter served as chief marshal until 1920, training hundreds of young lawmen in the methods Vernon and Thomas had developed. The academy became an institution, a legacy, a demonstration that frontier justice could evolve into something more permanent and more just. And James Wilson became the youngest chief marshal in territorial history at 26, taking command in 1895, when Eli stepped down to focus entirely on training. He served with distinction for 30 years, proved that the third generation could honor the traditions of the first while adapting to changing times. On a spring morning in 1900, Thomas Wilson stood at Anna's grave in the Santa Fe Cemetery. He was 77 years old. His hair had gone white as mountain snow. His hands shook slightly from palsy. But his mind remained sharp, his memories intact, his sense of the long arc of justice still clear. He had brought flowers, simple wildflowers from the mountain meadows Anna had loved, placed them on the grave marker with hands that remembered being steady enough to shoot coins from fence posts. 25 years, my love, Thomas said quietly. 25 years you have been gone. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime ago. The wind whispered through the cemetery pines. Somewhere a mourning dove called. We got him, Harrington, the man who killed you. He died in Widow's Canyon shot while drawing a weapon. Not the trial you deserved, not the public justice that would have cleared your name, but justice nonetheless. Thomas settled onto the bench beside the grave, the simple granite marker reading Anna Wilson, 1825 to 1875, beloved wife, faithful heart. James is chief marshal now. Did I tell you that last time? Maybe I did. Memory is not what it used to be, but he is good at it, better than I was in some ways. Has your compassion along with my stubbornness. That is a powerful combination. Footsteps approached from behind. Thomas knew the gait without looking, had trained that walk himself years ago. James Wilson, 31 years old, and wearing the chief marshal's badge with quiet authority, settled onto the bench beside his uncle. Uncle Thomas, Margaret said I would find you here. Checking up on the old man, visiting with family. There is a difference. James was quiet for a moment, reading the marker. I never knew Aunt Anna. She died before I was old enough to remember. But Mama says she would have liked me. She would have loved you, Thomas corrected. Would have spoiled you rotten with cookies and stories and all the things she never got to give her own children. You and Aunt Anna wanted children. We did. It never happened. Not sure why. The Lord's timing, she used to say. Looking back, maybe it was a blessing. This life would have been hard on children. All the absences, all the danger, all the times I chose duty over home. James studied his uncle's weathered profile. You feel you failed her. I know I failed her. Was not there when she died. Was off chasing some counterfeiter who mattered nothing compared to holding my wife's hand in her final hours. Thomas's voice remained steady through long practice. That failure shaped everything that came after, made me determined not to fail you when Blackwood took you. You did not fail me, Uncle Thomas. You saved me. You and Marshal Carter and Mrs. Stormwalker and Marshal Hastings. You showed me what real law enforcement looks like, not just the badge and the gun, the principles underneath, the commitment to doing right even when it costs. That is Vernon's teaching more than mine. It is yours too. You lived it every day I watched you. James paused. There is something I need to tell you about your work, about legacy. Thomas looked at him, seeing the young chief marshal who carried the weight of territorial law enforcement. What about it? The academy just graduated its largest class, 42 new marshals. We are opening a second campus in Arizona Territory next year. The methods you and Vernon developed, the training Eli refined it, is becoming standard across the West. James's voice carried quiet pride. You changed how law enforcement works out here, made it about skill and ethics instead of just who could shoot fastest. That was always the goal. Turn the frontier from lawless to lawful without losing what makes it unique. You succeeded. The numbers prove it. Crime rates dropping. Settlement increasing. Federal law gaining respect instead of resentment. James smiled. Your legacy is not just the men you caught, Uncle Thomas. It is the men you trained, the system you built, the idea that justice and frontier spirit can coexist. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, some burden he had carried since Anna died, since Vernon died, since all the mistakes and compromises and hard choices had piled up into a weight that threatened to crush him. Thank you for saying that, James. Means more than you know. They sat in comfortable silence, the old marshal and the young one, watching sunlight filter through pine branches and cast moving shadows on Anna's grave. "Uncle Thomas," James said finally, "I have a proposal, one last ride, you and me, out to Eagle's Nest Canyon, visit Mrs. Stormwalker, check on how retirement is treating her, then up through Devil's Backbone to Widow's Pass. See the country we fought to protect." Thomas felt a surge of something he had not experienced in years, not quite joy, not quite excitement, something deeper and more fundamental. The pull of open country and clear purpose and one more chance to ride with someone who understood. "I am 77 years old, James. Not sure I can manage long days in the saddle anymore." "Then we go slow. Make it a week instead of 3 days. Camp where we used to camp. Tell the old stories. Let me learn the territory the way you learned it. From someone who loves it." Thomas looked at his nephew, saw Anna's kindness in his eyes, saw Margaret's strength in his jaw, saw something of himself in the set of his shoulders and the way he wore the badge like a sacred trust rather than a decoration. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, if you are willing. Got our horses already selected. Supplies packed. Just need you to say yes." Thomas stood his joints protesting but still functional, reached down and touched Anna's marker one more time. "I will be gone for a week, my love, riding with James, teaching him the last things I know how to teach. I think you would approve." The wind seemed to whisper agreement through the pines. They rode out the next morning in the clear light of a spring dawn. Thomas on a steady sorrel gelding that had patience for an old man's slower pace. James on a gray mare that had the speed and endurance for whatever the journey might demand. They carried light packs and good rifles and 30 years of combined law enforcement experience. The country opened before them like a living memory. The mountain passes where Thomas had tracked outlaws. The canyons where Vernon had taught him patience. The hidden trails where Ayanna had shown him that Apache wisdom and frontier justice could complement each other. They visited Eagle's Nest Canyon on the 3rd day, found Ayanna, now 65, still running her homestead with quiet Apache efficiency. Ember the mare was long since passed, but her descendants filled the corrals. Fine horses that carried the bloodline Daniel had prized. Ayanna welcomed them with coffee and bread, and the easy hospitality of someone who had fought beside them and earned the right to family status. She and Thomas talked about old times, about Daniel and Vernon and Eli and all the people who had shaped their violent, purposeful lives. "The frontier is dying," Ayanna said, as sunset painted the canyon walls gold. "Not gone yet, but dying. The old ways, the hard ways, they are becoming stories now instead of daily reality." "Is that a good thing?" James asked. "It is a necessary thing," Ayanna replied. "Civilization requires the frontier to end. But something is lost when it does, a certain clarity, a certain honesty. Out here a man's word mattered because nothing else did. Now contracts and lawyers and institutions matter more." She looked at Thomas. "Your uncle understands this, spent his life trying to bring law without losing that clarity." "Did I succeed?" Thomas asked. "You tried, honorably. That is all any man can do." They rode on the next day, climbing toward Devil's Backbone and the high passes beyond. The trail was harder than Thomas remembered, steeper, more treacherous, or perhaps he was just older, more aware of mortality, more conscious that this might be his final journey through a country he had protected for so long. At Widow's Pass, where Vernon had staged federal forces during James's rescue, they made camp under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Thomas showed James the exact positions where marshals had waited, explained the tactical thinking, the backup plans, the way good law enforcement required thinking 3 steps ahead. "Uncle Thomas," James said as they watched the fire burn down to coals, "do you have regrets, things you would change if you could go back?" Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I would have been there when Anna died, would have chosen her over duty that one time when it mattered most." He paused. "But beyond that, no. I did the work that needed doing, tried to do it honorably, sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed, but always tried." "That is all we can do," James said, echoing Ayanna's words. "Yes, and then we pass it forward, to men like you and Eli, to the students at the academy, to everyone who believes that justice matters and that how we enforce it matters even more." Thomas looked at his nephew. "You will face choices I never had to make, technologies I cannot imagine, crimes that have not been invented yet, but the principles stay the same: honor, precision, knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. I will try to remember. You will do more than try, you will succeed, because you have something I never quite mastered. You have balance, work and family, duty and love. The things Vernon tried to teach me, but I learned too late." They returned to Santa Fe 7 days after departing, rode in through morning light with Thomas feeling every one of his 77 years, but also feeling something else: completion. The sense that his work, his long service, his complicated legacy had meaning beyond the individual cases and captures. James helped him dismount at the small house Thomas now called home. "Thank you, Uncle Thomas, for the ride, for the lessons, for everything. Thank you for asking, for caring enough to learn from an old man who has made more mistakes than most. We all make mistakes. The question is what we learn from them." James gripped his shoulder. "Get some rest. I will check on you tomorrow." Thomas watched his nephew ride away, the young chief marshal who represented everything he and Vernon had tried to build, then turned and entered his house, his body exhausted, but his spirit more at peace than it had been in 25 years. He died in his sleep that night. They found him in the morning, sitting in his reading chair with a book open on his lap. No pain evident on his weathered face, no sign of struggle. Just the quiet departure of a man who had fought his last fight and won his last victory, and was ready for whatever came next. The funeral drew marshals from 5 territories. Over 300 men who had trained under him or worked with him or simply respected what he represented. They buried Thomas Wilson beside Anna with full federal honors. The territorial governor spoke. The Chief Justice spoke. And James Wilson spoke last, his voice steady despite the grief. "My uncle taught me that law enforcement is not about power. It is about service. Not about the badge, but about what the badge represents. He made mistakes. He would be the first to tell you that. But he also made a difference. In this territory, in this profession, in the lives of everyone he touched." James paused, looking at the assembled marshals. Uncle Thomas and Marshal Hastings built something that outlasted them. An institution based on training and ethics, and the idea that frontier justice can evolve into something better. That legacy continues, in the academy, in you, in everyone who puts on a badge and remembers that how we enforce law matters as much as that we enforce it. They lowered Thomas Wilson into the earth beside the wife he had loved and failed and spent 25 years honoring. The wind whispered through the cemetery pines. The mountains that had witnessed his long service stood eternal and unchanging. And in the years that followed, the Federal Marshal Training Academy grew and evolved and spread Thomas Wilson's principles across the changing frontier. Eli Carter trained hundreds more marshals before his own retirement. James Wilson served as Chief Marshal until 1925, then transitioned to the newly formed FBI, where he helped shape federal law enforcement for another generation. The Academy continued operating until 1952, when changing times and new institutions absorbed its function. But by then, it had trained over 2,000 federal marshals, had established standards and practices that became foundation for modern law enforcement, had proved that one man's vision shared and refined and passed forward could reshape how justice worked in the American West. In the Academy's final year, they erected a plaque in the main hall, bronze and simple. It read, "Founded 1880, by Chief Marshal Thomas Wilson and Marshal Vernon Hastings, dedicated to the principle that law requires both strength and wisdom, precision, honor, legacy. And beneath those words, a quote from Wilson's testimony at the Blackwood trial: "Honor, even imperfect honor, deserves acknowledgement, because in country where law is still being written, how we treat our enemies shapes what kind of civilization we build." The plaque remained when the building was converted to other uses, remained as reminder and testament, remained as proof that one marshal who tried to do right, who failed and succeeded in measure, who built something larger than himself, had mattered. Thomas Wilson's legacy was not just the men he caught or the trials he won. It was the men he trained, the system he built. The idea that frontier justice and civilized law were not opposites, but partners in the long work of building a nation. And that legacy echoes still in every law enforcement academy, in every code of ethics, in every officer who remembers that the badge is a sacred trust, and that how we wield authority defines who we are. The frontier died, as frontiers must. But the best of what it taught survived, in institutions, in principles, in the quiet knowledge that honor matters, precision matters, and legacy is measured not in what we take from the world, but in what we build for those who follow. Thomas Wilson built well, and that in the end was enough.